Welcome to our second webcast, and today's topic is configuration mistakes with virtual IPs in Oracle RAC environment. You remember from the first webcast why we need to use virtual IPs and what it is. So today is the second part of that on that topic. So whenever connection request reaches a listener will decide which instance should this connection go to. This is so-called server-side load balancing. And server-side load balancing is possible because of remote listener registration. So every instance when it's running registers with a local listener. It's Pmon process that is responsible for that, and it sends signals, sends certain information to the listener running on the local host. And the local underscore listener init Aura parameter is the one defining the listener connection. So at the same time, instance will send information about services and its attributes to the remote listeners, and there is a remote listener parameter which is defining the connection descriptor and defining the list of the remote listeners that the instance should be registered with. So let's look at the quick example of how it's working. So I have a 2-node cluster, and let's say I have a connection descriptor with those two virtual IPs, load balancing enabled, using service name, so everything is fine to connect to the cluster database, right? So let's say I spawn several connections to this cluster database. Okay, let's get a bit few of those. Okay, should be enough now. Okay, so I have like something about 10 connections. Right. So let's see what are the virtual IPs I use. LH1 VIP and LH2 VIP, right? And the virtual IP is 201, 202 in this network. So let's use netstat to see where my connections are going to. So you remember I specify virtual IPs in my connection descriptor. So we would expect that all those connections going to those two virtual IPs, right? Let me grab for 1521. So those are all connections to the listener port that they're listening on. And we can see that some connections indeed go to the virtual IPs, while others are going to different IPs, and those are actually the main host IPs. If I grab for this IP, you will see it's actually a main LH1 and LH2 IPs, which is strange. So remember that we specified the virtual IP in the connection descriptor. Okay, so let's have a look at the listener configuration and the instance configuration. So this is what happens when database is created manually by DBCA, and DBCA configures remote listener registration, but slightly missing one thing, a very important thing. So if you look listener CTL status, we could see that service G4 is provided by those two instances. So remote registration is working. If we look at the local and remote listener parameters for the instances, we could see that remote listener is set, that's what DBCA does. It's set to this connection descriptor, and the local listener is left empty. So what happens when local listener is left empty is that instance will try to register with a listener on the local host, on the main host IP, and listening on the standard 1521. So assuming we have this listener configured by default, the local listener registration will work just fine. So this is what DBCA adds to the TNS names or a file, right? Listeners G4 is used for remote listener registration, and it's using virtual IP, which is fine. So everything seems to be good. But yeah, that's the same. So if you look at listener CTL service, then we could see that service G4 has two instances, G41 and G42. But what's interesting is that if you look at the connection descriptor for the remote instances, this is a connection descriptor which listener used to forward the connection to the remote instance and when it's needed. Those connection descriptors using a standard a main host IP. They do not use a host virtual IP. Why is that? Well, apparently it's because we did not specify or we did not configure properly local listener parameter. So how do we fix it? The same, right? So how do we fix it? Well, we add to TNS names several new connection descriptors. So local listener registration will now go through virtual IP, not through the main host IP as it happens by default. And we also need to set local listener init or parameter appropriately for each instance. To listener G41 for first instance and to listener G42 for the second instance. So that's what we've done already. What happens now if we call listenerctl service is you would see that the virtual IPs are used for the remote listener. The listener is using virtual IPs for the remote instances. So what happens now when connection request comes to the listener and listener decides to forward it to the remote IP, in this case it will forward using the virtual IP and not using the main host IP as we saw before. So let me clean up the previous sessions. Okay, yes, no more sessions. Right, so let's start a few more SQL Plus sessions. Okay, few more. Okay, so we've got few. Let's see what netstart will show us. Okay, the few old connections being cleaned up. They will be cleaning up soon. But the ones which are established, you could see those all new connections are established to the virtual IPs 202, 201, and etc. Right? So this is a proper configuration of the virtual IPs, and this is how your connection from client should be established. Again, the local listener is a very important parameter which is missed by default by DBCA. It's actually logged as a bug on the MetaLink, I think, but apparently it's just a misconfiguration. It's not a bug itself. Well, you can consider it as a DBCA bug, but it's not a problem with the Oracle database itself. So let's quickly review what are the potential issues with the DIP configuration. So the DBCA by default adds this connection descriptor to the tnsnames.ora file, and you would need to add few more entries for the remote listener registration. For every host you would need the local listener with a local virtual IP. What else we need to do is that we need to fix local listener, because DBCA leave it empty. It's only set remote listener. And if you look at listenerctl status, you would see that remote registration is working, but if you look at the listenerctl service, you will see that for remote instances, listener doesn't use virtual IP. So this is what's wrong. This is what's wrong when you leave local listener empty by default. So what needs to be done is you need to add those connection descriptors as I already showed, and for the 4 nodes example like here, for each instance you need to set the local listener appropriately, referencing the local configuration, local listener. So what you will see now when you call listenerctl service, you will see in the details of the service that all the remote instances are using virtual IP, and this is how it's supposed to work, right? So with this, we're going to finish today's session, and stay tuned and come to the next video cast, which will be about troubleshooting Oracle 12545 errors. This is a error indicating a host name resolution problem, and what is the specific with Oracle RAC. So drop me an email if you have any comments or any feedback. Find us on Pythian group blog, and this is where the video casts are published, so subscribe to this one, and find me on Twitter as well. If you're not on Twitter, it's probably a good time to get there. Thanks again for listening. If you got there, it must have been interesting.